In this video, we are going to help Intrepid balance combat for both PvE and PvP. Balancing classes doesn't mean making classes the same, but means giving each class equal amounts of strengths and weaknesses. For example, in PvP, mages could be superior when fighting warriors, but warriors could be superior when fighting rogues, and rogues could be superior when fighting mages. Or, in PvE, rogues could be superior when fighting low armor bosses, while mages are superior when fighting bosses clad in plate armor. Okay, the 4 combat types that we are going to help Intrepid balance are damage, tanking, healing, and utility. First, balancing damage classes. With damage classes, we have melee versus ranged and physical versus magical. Melee classes need instant cast or front-loaded damage abilities, whereas ranged classes need cast times or back-loaded damage abilities. But why? The reason is that melee classes will have less uptime on the target, as they have a proximity requirement, whereas ranged classes will have more uptime on the target, as they can do damage at range. Essentially, melee needs a way to quickly dump their damage abilities onto the target before the target moves out of range, while not making melee overpowered in fights where the bosses stand still. This can be achieved through unique resource management and damage over time abilities. I touched on unique resource management in my previous video. However, melee classes need a unique ability resource that depletes very quickly on use, but also recharges very quickly. This allows melee classes to cast 2 or 3 damage spells quickly, while also quickly depleting that resource. When the ability resource is spent, the melee classes will do minimal damage until the ability resource starts to recharge. When the target moves out of range, the ability resource will continue to recharge very quickly. When the melee closes the gap to the target, he or she can quickly dump their damage ability resource again and do big damage. This unique ability resource allows melee classes with only 50% uptime on the target to do only slightly less damage than the same melee class with 100% uptime on the enemy target. Yet another way to balance melee damage is to give melee classes damage over time effects, such as bleeds or poisons. This allows the melee to quickly apply the dot. The target will continue to take damage even if they move out of melee range. Ranged classes will have more uptime on the target than their melee comrades. To balance range damage, ranged classes need cast timers, allowing them to do more damage only if stationary, but less damage if forced to constantly move. Essentially, enemy mechanics mitigate melee damage by kiting, teleporting around the map, or flying in the air, and enemy mechanics mitigate range damage by creating do not stand zones, forcing ranged classes to be on the move and preventing them from free casting. So Intrepid needs to balance not just classes, but also boss mechanics. Of course, it is great to have some boss mechanics where ranged damage dealers are the clear winners, and other boss mechanics where melee damage dealers are the clear winners. For PvP, balancing melee versus ranged is always difficult. On the one hand, if you give too many escape mechanics, then ranged classes can kite and kill melee without ever getting hit. On the other hand, if you give melee too many gap closing mechanics, then ranged classes get bursted down too easily. Generally, in an open field with no obstacles, a ranged class should be able to out-kite, free cast, and win. However, in tighter space with obstacles that can break line of sight and therefore break the cast time of the spell or ability, then melee should win. Of course, the game is not balanced around 1v1s, but rather is balanced around group content. However, I think it is important to at least keep in mind the 1v1 scenarios, as solo questing will definitely be a thing. Physical damage is mitigated by armor, and magical damage is mitigated by magical resistances. Against an enemy target with no physical armor and no magical resistance, the 2 damage types should deal roughly the same amount of damage. Some enemy types should have higher armor, and other enemy types should have higher magical defense, such that each damage type will excel at different fights. For PvP, physical damage types excel at killing cloth-wearing classes, and the magic damage types excel at killing plate-wearing classes. However, armor categories and ashes are agnostic to class, meaning that mages can wear plate armor and tanks can wear cloth armor. If wearing a full cloth armor set provides bonus magic defense, maybe a warrior clad in cloth is the perfect counter to mages. In any event, armor type is not linked to the primary archetype, such that Intrepid can't use armor as a way to balance classes for PvP. Additionally, all damage types, both magic and physical, and ranged and melee, should be able to spec into either a more burstier damage build or a more sustaining damage build. This should be done through talent allocation, the secondary archetype, and other augments. Second, tank balancing. There's only one tank archetype, so Intrepid only only needs to balance different builds that exist via the secondary archetype, other augments, and talent allocations. You generally want tanks that specialize in preventative damage, self-healing, or high HP tanks. Again, don't make a tanking subspec best at everything. For PvP, tanking needs to have damage mitigation and crowd control abilities. Think of a tank's role in League of Legends. In teamfights, the tank's job is to soak up damage and lock down the kill target for others to finish. As such, tanks need the best crowd control abilities with some sort of instigating gap closer. Third, balancing healers. Again, we only have the cleric as the main healer. For healing, you want to allow builds and augments that allow for specialization in solo healing, group healing, mana efficiency, healing over time, and preventative healing. These healing subsets allow people to build their own role-playing healer class. Again, you don't want a build to be the best at each healing subset. For PvP, healing needs to be able to out-heal the damage dealers by a healthy margin, such that the only way to kill another player would be to stun or disable the group's healer, or get the kill target out of range or line of sight from the healer. Naturally, the healer should do way less damage than the other damaged classes. Fourth, balancing utility. Each class needs to have its own utility that should augment the group. You want the optimal 8-man group to include one of each archetype. One way to do this is to give a utility spell or aura that doesn't stack. For example, if the summoner gives an aura that increases damage by 10% for each group member, and this aura doesn't stack with other summoner auras, then there is less of an incentive to have two of a single class. Additionally, we can't talk about utility without talking about the Bard. The Bard is championed as the utility or support class. Utility classes only succeed if they buff the group in a way that is better than having another pure DPS role. For example, pretend a Bard does 0 base damage and only buffs the group. We know this isn't true, but just pretend. Then, the Bard must buff the other players by at least 1/5 or 20%. With this 20% buff from the Bard, the other remaining 5 damage dealers can do the same damage as a group with 6 damage dealers, ignoring the tanks and healers damage. If Bards are going to be beneficial for groups, then they will need to bring some real good utility. For PvP, the Bard needs to help team fights with positioning, buffing the damage dealers, and debuffing the enemy. Again, think of League of Legends and how Blitzcrank can change a team fight by pulling an enemy player out of position. These are the types of abilities that the Bard will need for PvP. These are the 4 areas of combat that Intrepid needs to properly balance for both PvE and PvP. Subscribe and I'll see you in the next one. Peace!